I'm Giovana Romano Sanchez, and you're listening to Here and Now at the Huntington, a podcast from the Huntington Library, Art Museum, and Botanical Gardens. In this episode, we look at travel in the 1800s. How people wrote about it, how they depicted it, and what those representations meant for Americans who, like most of us right now, couldn't venture far from home. The first time David Marshall went to the sea was in 1816. After saving money for 6 months, he made a deal with the captain of an American schooner, who agreed to take him on board on their trip to Martinique. The first part of the journey went well. It was the way back that scared him. Marshall got sick. Food supplies were running low, and he was starving. It was a traumatic experience, especially for a 13-year-old boy who had run away from home. That first trip almost killed Marshall. But it didn't keep him from going back to sea.
It's kind of a strange compulsion that he felt.
He ended up spending his whole life serving on different ships.
He was destined to be a seaman, and seaman he was.
Including some vessels he described as of doubtful character.
Marshall actually was kind of proud to acknowledge that his early naval career was basically a pirate.
And we know all of that because Marshall, whose wild behavior as a kid earned him the nickname Wicked Ned, he left a diary. A 1,000-page diary that Olga Sapina, the Huntington's curator of American historical manuscripts, knows well.
His memoirs actually is quite spectacular because they're heavily illustrated. He is a very good draftsman. He was self-taught, and usually what he drew was something that he was seeing at the moment.
Through Ned's words and sketches, we get a glimpse of his voyages, of what the life of a sailor was like in the mid-19th century. As you can imagine, it was not luxurious.
It's kind of like living in a floating small apartment and spending a lot of time with a lot of people, being exposed to a lot of stuff, including contagion. And also being bored out of your mind.
Boredom. Days running into one another. It's something we can understand right now, as we travel less and stay at home more because of the pandemic. So, Wicked Ned would go to the sea, have a horrible time.
There was a actually hilarious poem that he describes the adventures of the sailors on USS Raritan in 1843, including a very funny and very graphic description of everybody being seasick at the same time.
He would swear to never go back.
And then inevitably would return. He called it the embrace of Daddy Neptune. He had a very warm relationship with the ancient god of the sea.
And I can't help but think that he kept doing this because even though he was in a boring, overcrowded, floating apartment, it was still moving. It was taking him to different places.
He is drawing the pictures of watercolors of exotic places and vegetation and trees and flowers and animals and people he sees.
I mean, who got to experience that?
He is very much aware that what he sees is something that none of his peers in Connecticut would see.
Even more than today, in the early 1800s, traveling was a privilege, especially international trips. They lasted months, and as Wicked Ned knew well, they were dangerous undertakings. But if traveling was inaccessible, imagining it was not. And for that, there was always art.
In the 19th century, American patrons began to acquire in very large numbers paintings of ships and also landscapes of places far away from where they lived or suggesting new modes of transportation.
This is Dennis Carr.
I'm the Virginia Steele Scott Chief Curator of American Art at the Huntington.
Dennis says during the early 1800s, people who couldn't travel would consume art that would give them that experience.
In this time period, you could have been an armchair tourist sitting in your parlor or wherever you were in your household, contemplating places that were far away from your local world. It was also the same time when people began commissioning artists to paint landscapes in parlors, like right on the walls of parlors, that kind of transported them to faraway places.
Sound familiar? That photograph of your favorite garden on your desktop? The hundreds of pictures of beautiful landscapes we have been looking at on Instagram, or exploring different cities with Google Street View? They make us feel closer to the places we love or want to be. In fact, psychologists say that looking at images of nature can help reduce stress, anxiety, and even boost sustained attention. Americans in the 19th century didn't necessarily know all of that, but they were practicing it with paintings. At that time, the work of some American artists especially evoked the sensation of travel. One of them was Fitz Henry Lane.
He was born in New England and spent most of his life in New England painting scenes around his home in Gloucester, Massachusetts.
When Lane was a kid, he had an illness that left him paralyzed from the waist down. So he had to use crutches for most of his life.
He was limited in the distances that he could travel himself, but he specialized in painting beautiful seascape images, especially paintings of ships in Gloucester Harbor, but also nearby Boston Harbor.
At the time, New England was showing its naval strength, sending many ships across the Atlantic to trade. So Lane painted
images of ships and vessels that could have traveled great distances that suggested a much wider world than the area around where he lived.
One of those paintings is Sailing Ships Off the New England Coast.
This is an incredibly energetic painting from the middle of the 1850s. Most of Lane's pictures were quite calm, but this is a very different kind of view with one a three-masted ship sailing into the harbor at full sail.
The sea is agitated. The waves are rising, and the clouds churn in the sky. In the background, you see two large ships departing.
This painting is filled with energy and gusto, and this suggests to me the energy around the shipping trade, specifically in Gloucester Harbor. He would have seen many ships coming and going during the course of his days spent there.
Another American landscape painter of the period was Frederick Church. But unlike Lane, who stayed close to home,
Church traveled far and wide throughout the Americas and brought back incredible images from his travels.
Church was inspired by the work of Alexander von Humboldt, a German naturalist who had published very detailed geological and natural studies of Latin America. And Church decided to explore those places in person.
And so in the 1850s, Frederick Church followed in the footsteps of von Humboldt and traveled throughout Colombia and Ecuador, sketching volcanoes and rivers and forests.
Among the paintings that came out of his trips is one called Chimborazo.
And in this painting, the focus is the volcano of Chimborazo, which was the climax of von Humboldt's travels. Church went to the same places that von Humboldt had stayed, and sketched Chimborazo from various angles.
When you first look at this painting, your eyes are immediately drawn to the foreground,
which shows a river and a small boat. And in the foreground, there's this incredible lush greens and browns evoking the tropical Ecuadorian rainforest.
But when your eyes move up the canvas,
there's a kind of pinkish range of mountains. This is, high up in the Andes of Ecuador. And then as your eye follows the canvas even higher, there's just the smallest flecks of white paint.
And then you see Chimborazo rising in the distance.
Almost like it's floating in the clouds.
Chimborazo and the other paintings of the series were a huge success at the time.
And Church, when he was traveling in the 1850s, it was a very difficult place to go, Ecuador, in this time period. And he had to travel by rail and later by ship and then even a smaller vessel, and would go up the rivers just as far as he could.
So he was capturing something that most people didn't have the chance to see at the time.
What made Church very famous is that his paintings of his travels in Ecuador and Colombia were shown to vast numbers of people who would line up around the block to see them. It became a sensation in the time period. All these people longing to travel with Church to these far-off places.
Even though the world of Wicked Ned, Fitz and Frederick Church was very different from ours, today's pandemic is making us pause.
It has really changed our perspective.
It's making us use our imagination.
It brings us back to this moment in the 19th century when we were relying on images to take us places.
From inside our houses, confronted with boredom, we travel the world through our screens. And like those who in the 19th century appreciated landscape and seascape paintings from their parlors, we are being reminded of the power of those images, the power of language, of music, the power of art, to let us explore the world while we're unable to step outside. And thanks to museums and libraries, we can also step back in time and look at the same images people before us used to transport themselves, when they, too, couldn't easily go far from home. This was the second episode of Here and Now at the Huntington. In our show notes, you can find images of the paintings mentioned in this episode, as well as of Wicked Ned's diary. Thanks for listening, and stay well.